Hey, this episode of Musings of a SoCal Pastor is going to be a little bit longer. We're dealing with a subject in this episode of the Israel-Hamas war. And the reason why is I've been asked by a number of people to give my perspective on this. And so I'm doing that. There's a lot of news out there. There's a lot of information. I've discovered by asking in some of our Sunday morning services how many of you watch the news regularly, and I'm rather surprised at the number of people who do not watch the news regularly. Of course, they hear the news infrequently, and right now they're hearing news that seems rather confusing to them. And so they're asking what a proper biblical perspective on this would be. And so I wanted to share some thoughts here for those that are kind of wondering, how do I process all of this? First of all, one of the things that you're going to hear as you listen to the news is the reference to Gaza and the West Bank. These areas that are actually controlled by, have been turned over to the Palestinians, the West Bank to their political organization known as Fatah, and then Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip. They're both Palestinian regions, but they're governed by two different Palestinian governmental groups, Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is an overtly terrorist organization that advocates strongly for the complete annihilation of the state of Israel. And one of the things that you will hear in reference to the West Bank and to Gaza is that they are occupied territories. And the implication that many people have is that occupied territory means because Israeli troops are in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So let's clear something up. They're not. Israeli military is not in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Yes, the border between the West Bank and Israel and the Gaza Strip is regulated by the Israeli military, and they have over recent years built walls between these Palestinian territories and the state of Israel. And the reason why is because of the frequent attacks that I'm sure you will remember from not long ago of what were called suicide bombers that came to be called homicide bombers that would pack C4 into vests with ball bearings and nuts and bolts and then go into civilian areas, crowded areas like buses, malls, shopping centers, schools, and blow themselves up. And then a little bit later, they came up with the strategy of one homicide bomber doing that. And then when the first responders would come to deal with the wounded, another homicide bomber would then blow him or herself up to take out the first responders. The idea was to spread terror. And among the civilian population, these homicide bombers were not attacking military targets, they were attacking civilian targets. And then you'll remember as well that over recent years, there has been incessant rocket attacks coming out of Gaza into south and central Israel. Again, when the phrase occupied territory is used by Western media, the implication is that Israeli troops are in Gaza and the West Bank and that they are acting as an oppressive force over the Palestinians. That is not true. What the Palestinians mean by, and specifically what Hamas and Fatah mean by occupied territory, is all of Israel. When they say occupied territory, they are referring to all of what they call Palestine. They do not recognize the state of Israel. They consider the nation state of Israel as an illegitimate, illegal entity, and that the occupied territory is all of what is known as today Israel. You will frequently hear the call for a two-state solution. Israel was willing to have a two-state solution where there would be a state of Israel alongside a Palestinian state. It is the Palestinians who have consistently refused to have a two-state solution. It was suggested when it was under British control in 1938, then again in 1947, in the year 2000 and 2008. Israel has been willing to recognize the establishment of a Palestinian state It was the Palestinians who said no, and the reason why was because they refuse to have a two-state solution. They demand that there be one state, that it be the state of Palestine, and that there be no Israel. So when they refer to the occupied territories, they mean all of Israel. They believe should be a Palestinian state. There should be no Israel. There should be no Jews living in the land, period. There are no Jews in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. None. There are Jewish settlements in the West Bank who want to live at peace alongside the Palestinians that are there. But Jews are not allowed in Gaza because Hamas is far more militant in its opposition to not just the state of Israel, but to the presence of Jews in what they call their homeland. You may have heard the phrase, and you will see this now in the protests that are taking place in major urban centers of the United States and Europe and on college campuses. This phrase is used, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And they mean from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it's all Palestine, and it will be free. Free of what? Free of Jewish presence. This gets at something that really connects to what happened on October 7th. The UN General Secretary decried the attacks on October 7th when Hamas blew up sections of the wall separating the Gaza Strip from Israel. And some 3,000 Hamas terrorists then entered Jewish communities to murder, rape, burn, decapitate, brutalize civilians. They happened upon some Israeli soldiers, but only because they were living among the regular populace. They went after civilians, babies, women, children, and body cam footage of their activity proves the brutality. They were intent on doing one thing. There was no attempt to acquire strategic land. There was no attempt to conquer land and establish a beachhead for a military conquest of Israel. They had one desire, one agenda, and that was to kill, to murder. It was an expression of their deep-seated hatred of Jews. Not the state of Israel, of Jews. And this gets to the real heart of the issue that we need to keep in mind as we process how to think about this whole thing. Anti-Semitism is what is driving this. This isn't a political issue. This isn't a regional issue that is driven simply by the politics of the time. That certainly plays into it. But the root cause of this is anti-Semitism. It is a demonically inspired hatred of the Jewish people. As we look to the book of Revelation, we find that there is a passage that speaks of Satan's great hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And that when he is cast from heaven to earth, he comes with great violence. And what does he do? He goes after the Jewish people. Why? Because Satan understands that his fate is tied to the nation of Israel. God has chosen them to be the vehicle through whom he would work his prophetic scenario, prophetic clock, in bringing the Messiah, who would first come to die for our sins and to rise again from the dead for our justification and new life, but who will ultimately come to reverse the fall, to reverse the curse that took place in the Garden of Eden. And so Satan hates the Jewish people because his fate is tied to their national existence. It is through the people of Israel and the nation of Israel that God will work. This is clearly laid out in the book of Daniel and other prophetic passages. So Satan thinks that he can forestall the plan of God by ridding the world of Israel and the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is an interesting form of racism in that it's difficult to sort out where it comes from or what it's driven by, and yet it has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Why this profound, deep-seated hatred of the Jewish people to the degree that there would be justified wholesale slaughter of them for no other reason than they are Jewish. That is demonically inspired. It's satanically generated because he knows that his fate is tied to the existence of Israel and the Jewish people in a Jewish homeland. So that is what you saw graphically portrayed in the events of October 7th when Hamas terrorists broke out of their land, Gaza, and attacked these Jewish settlements. And it is why the nation of Israel today, the Jewish leadership, realizes that there can be no negotiating with Hamas, and quite frankly, with the Palestinian people if they support what Hamas has done. The reports that I have received from people in Israel, the mentality of the Jewish people is this right now, an absolute resolution that they must end Hamas, that they cannot tolerate. There is no negotiating with them. Hamas made clear its desire and its intention, and that there can be no negotiating with them. There can be no negotiating with, quite frankly, the Palestinian people who support Hamas in their agenda. There has to be an end of Hamas. There has to be a change of mind on the part of the Palestinians in their willingness to negotiate with Israel. As long as their mentality is, we will never tolerate the existence of a Jewish homeland, there can be no negotiation. And so there seems to be this resolution now on the part of the Israeli leadership that this war must be prosecuted to its end. And that's why they cannot listen to the international calls for a ceasefire, because the ceasefire would draw a line that basically allows Hamas to continue. If Hamas is allowed to survive, then what will happen is October 7th will happen all over again. In fact, I got to go get my phone. I'll be right back. Oh, I want to read this to you. I just read this morning. This is from Daily Wire news source, just quoting top Hamas official Ghazi Hamad said during a recent interview that the terrorist organization was ready to launch as many repeats of their October 7th terrorist attack, dubbed the Al-Aqsa Flood, as needed until everyone in Israel is murdered. Hamad made the remarks during an interview late last month on LBC TV, a Lebanese news channel, after Hamas terrorists murdered 1,400 Israelis, wounded 5,300 plus, and kidnapped approximately 240. He said this, quote, "Israel is a country that has no place on our land," unquote, he declared. Quote, "We must remove that country because it constitutes a security, military, and political catastrophe to the Arab and Islamic nation and must be finished. We are not ashamed to say this with full force," unquote. He goes on, quote, "We must teach Israel a lesson, and we will do this again and again," he said. So that is the position of Hamas. They are dedicated to the eradication, the annihilation of the state of Israel and the Jewish people in what they call their land, Palestine. In 1967, the Arab League met and agreed upon what were called the three no's, that there would be, number one, no peace with Israel, number two, that there would be no negotiation with Israel over any kind of two-state solution, and number three, there would be no recognition of Israel as a legitimate state belonging in their land. That is why today, in many Arab, Islamic textbooks in their schools, on their maps, there's no Israel. It's called Palestine. They refuse to recognize the existence of Israel. In 2005, when it became clear that there was going to be no two-state solution, Israel decided that they would just leave the Gaza Strip. They turned the Gaza Strip over to the Palestinians and removed all their troops at that time. Again, it's not occupied territory. So they just pulled all their troops out and turned the region over to Palestinian control. Now, Fatah was, at that time, the designated Palestinian governmental group, the Palestinian Authority, But the people of Gaza decided to go with a more radical version of government, and that was Hamas. And so Hamas ended up taking control of the Gaza Strip, and the world wanted to make this successful, this new territory of Gaza and the West Bank. And so they poured billions of dollars in aid into these regions. I tried to calculate how much money the United States has given to the Palestinians, and I was able to total up, it looks like right about $7 billion the United States has given to the Palestinians to build up their state, infrastructure, those kinds of things. The European Union between 2014 and 2020 has contributed about $4.5 billion. So there's a lot of money has gone into that region. This was supposed to be for aid. It was supposed to be for the development of this area because the Israelis had pulled out. Well, until October 7th, Israel continued to provide water, electricity, and fuel for Gaza. Those were coming from Israel. Israel was providing those things to Gaza. Instead of Hamas taking the aid money that was given to them and using it for the development of infrastructure, what's more basic to infrastructure than water and power and fuel for your vehicles? Those are the most basic elements that are needed for any kind of a functioning society. But they depended on Israel to provide those things and used that money instead to buy weapons, rockets, to stockpile medical supplies and food in their approximately 500 kilometers of tunnels that they have built. Why would they build tunnels under their territory unless they were planning to use them for covert activity against Israel? So all this money that was given by other nations to help make the Palestinian regions successful for their people was instead used to fund hostilities towards Israel. Then, when Israel turned off the water and the electricity and the fuel to Gaza after October 7th, the world cried out, "This is terrible. How can you treat these innocent civilians this way?" The question that should be asked on the part of Western media and Western politicians is not, how could Israel do that? The question is, why was Israel providing water and electricity and fuel to begin with? Why was not a better job done with the billions in aid that were given by the West to these countries to build up their infrastructure? That's the question that should be asked. Hamas knows that the West does not want innocent civilians to be caught up in the violence of this war. So they use civilians to hide behind. They have put all of their control centers underneath hospitals and in schools. They launch rockets from schools and from hospital rooftops because they know that then they can use a camera that when Israel then strikes them, they can take footage of that and release it to the Western press, and it turns the West against Israel. So Hamas gets to do whatever it wants in terms of attacking Israel, but the moment that Israel counterattacks to remove that threat, it's blamed. And what is Israel doing? Israel is protecting its citizens. So the bottom line of the criticism of Western mainstream legacy media about Israel's attacks on Gaza, it in effect is saying it's okay for Hamas to kill Israeli citizens, civilians, but it's not okay for Israel in going after a legitimate target, by the way, by the determination of the Red Cross on what constitutes legitimate military targets is when a military force uses civilians in the prosecution of its attacks. Then civilians are in fact an unfortunate victim, but they become the consequence not of the military that is attacking the military that's attacking them, they become, and I hate to use this phrase, but it's reality, collateral damage. No one likes civilians dying. No one. Israel, as a nation, has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And it will try to protect Palestinian citizens to the degree that it is able to. And that is why it has followed a policy until just recently of contacting the civilians of an area they were about to bomb to warn them that they were about to bomb so that they could move. That policy has had to change for this reason. Hamas has kept civilians from moving to safety because they want to use them on their film to show their death, to turn Western populations against Israel. This is all part of the Hamas strategy. A Hamas official just this week said that Hamas's responsibility is to work for the end of Israel and that it is the United Nations' responsibility to take care of Palestinian civilians. So here is the government that was chosen by the Palestinians in Gaza saying, we're not responsible for those civilians. That's the UN's responsibility. Now last, one of the things that if you end up watching some of the news coverage of some of the protests that have been taking place on college campuses, one of the things that you'll hear is the pro-Hamas side will say that Israel should cease to exist because of the process of what's known as de-colonization. And it's this idea, quite frankly, it's a Marxist idea. It became very popular in the 1950s and has spread from there, that colonialism, which was practiced by European powers, is unjust and that it needs to be rectified. The idea of a colony is that you have a mother country that colonizes another nation, another region, and uses the people that are there for its own benefit, its own prosperity. So it takes the resources and the value and the prosperity out of a particular colony, and it ships it back to the mother colony or the mother country so that it can enjoy that wealth. And the idea that is unjust. And so under the rubric of decolonization, Israel should cease to exist. And the reason why was because Israel was made up. And now this is a real twisting of history. The idea is that Israel was the result of, and again, this isn't historically accurate at all, but this is what they're saying. This is what young people are being taught, that Israel was ultimately the result of the end of World War I, when Britain and France won over Germany. They then had the power to redistribute the borders for the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had been allied with Germany during World War I, and of course the Axis powers were defeated in World War I, and so now the victors, to the victor go the spoils. And so at the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France sat down with a map and they redrew all the lines and the borders for the nations of the Middle East. And Lebanon became the territory France that was going to be responsible for, and then Palestine below Lebanon became the British mandate. And so this idea is that, well, because the British were in control, Palestine, they called it Palestine because it was coming from what the Romans had called it, that the British then turned it into a colony. And that's where Arabs lived. By the way, when we use the phrase Palestinian, please understand, these are Arabs. They're called Palestinians because they lived in Palestine, and a name that was given to the region by the Romans. In the mid-2nd century, after the Jews had rebelled, the Romans finally said, we're done with the Jewish rebellion. And so they renamed Israel Palestine after the Jews' ancient nemesis, the Philistines. They wanted to just erase all evidence of Jewish occupation. Well, let's be clear. The region had belonged to the Jews from the 15th century BC all the way through the mid-2nd century AD. That's a fact. It was a Jewish homeland for all of that time. There's abundant archaeological and historical evidence to prove that. So this idea that Israel was made up by the British as they took a pencil and just drew lines on a map after World War I is absurd. It wasn't called Israel until 1948 when the Jews declared independence. The British had been kind of controlling the area, and Israel at that point reestablished themselves in their homeland, their ancient homeland. That's never been a colony of the British. And the Jewish roots in that land predate the Arab occupation. Read the Bible, for goodness sake, read the Bible. It's well established there, going all the way back to the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. Not only is it the historic homeland of them, it's the biblical homeland of them. God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Now, of course, the secular world doesn't want to acknowledge that. But to justify Hamas's war against Israel on the basis of decolonization is absurd. And yet it is what many of the young people that are protesting and, in some cases, rioting are advocating, because they've been told a lie.